as you know, we're interested in adolescence and the rising number coming into the care system. But can you think about more broadly what aspects of the current family justice, youth justice and child welfare systems act as obstacles to achieving good outcomes for children? So, in fact, prevent people working in those systems doing the best for the kids they're working with.
Yeah, I think and thinking about this, and I've done quite a lot of work in different parts of Europe over the years, and so partly my response to this is, I think, a bit coloured by my experience of seeing what goes on in other countries. And I think a big issue for me is about underfunding, and I want to kind of connect that to two wider things. One is family poverty and the kind of wider welfare support for young people and families, and the other is funding for the system, because I think those two things together, what it means is that we end up with our systems in this country, and I think it's true for family justice and youth justice, are very kind of residual. So in both cases, they kick in when things get to crisis point, to breaking point, rather than being a kind of family service oriented system where, as a society, we have responsibilities to support the upbringing and the well-being of children, young people at all ages, and what kind of services and support do we need to put in place to do that. And I think just the fact that we have that division between a family justice system and a youth justice system, rather than them both being part of kind of conceptualizing support for young people, that to me just kind of sums up that really fundamental issue. We, and this is a few years ago now, but we visited on a project I did, basically like a kind of secure unit in France for young people specifically for young people who'd been involved in crime. And France has a higher age of criminal responsibility than England, so it's kind of different from that point of view as well. But the manager of that unit that we visited talked about the purpose of the unit, the purpose of their work, as being creating the French term is cadre de vie. It's like an environment for life, is what she was saying, and it really kind of this is like 15 years ago, I think we were there, but it's one of those things that's really stayed with me, is that kind of idea of, that should be a common purpose, is giving people an environment for life, rather than something that is purely risk and deficit focused, which then leads you into a construction of young people and families just in terms of risk and deficit. And that doesn't mean you don't attend to risk. That doesn't mean you don't attend to the areas where the family needs to be supported, where people's situations need to be strengthened. But it means you're not just starting from a point of when things get so bad, when things get so difficult. It's only at that point that we start to pay attention, we start to intervene. And I guess the kind of other side of that, and I would say from research that I've done involving families and children, young people, is that it also means, I think it feeds into the kind of stigmatizing construction of the young person. And that's something, I think, anyway, in this country, we have quite a lot of stigma about young people. Just looking at all the debates about young people in COVID, for example, really brings that home. But when you only in family justice and youth justice, when you're only intervening with young people starting to get involved when they get to crisis point, I think what that also means is that and certainly with people I've spoken to in my research, the systems and the professionals who are trying to do what they can to help young people are really because the focus becomes on the risk. What you end up with is then not paying enough attention to people's strengths, to their care, to their responsibilities. And very often in interviews that I've done and myself and my colleagues have done with young people who've come into care in their teens, they've very often been involved in looking after parents who've got serious difficulties, looking after younger siblings when parents haven't been able to do that. And I think that's not recognised and valued enough, because we construct people as problems rather than appreciating their strength and their care.
Thank you. That's really interesting. There's a number of things there I'd like to follow up on. That last one about the construction as problems is do you think that's something to do? I mean, we tend to demonize young people. You've talked about that, but is there also a failure, or sometimes a treat? They're a child; they shouldn't be doing that, which also kicks in.
I think that's right, and I think we do that with children and young people of all ages. So I've just, I've just been teaching this morning, and one of the concepts in social pedagogy that we've been talking about is the idea of the rich child, and respecting children's competence, respecting their expertise in their own lives. And we've been talking about that this morning in relation to work in early childhood. And so I guess I would say if it applies in the nursery years, it certainly applies when you're working with teenagers, that we have a kind of tendency to thinking, that we protect the child, we protect childhood innocence, and those sort of ideas that, almost come from kind of Victorian times or even before that, of the kind of perfect little innocent child who's in need of protection. And that means we don't necessarily pay enough attention to children's strengths, to their competence, to their own understandings of their experience. And so listening to that is another really important part of it. And I guess that partly comes out of developmental psychology in a way, because developmental psychology as a discipline is often very focused on what children can't do yet. So you're at this stage of development, so you haven't. And, when people talk about the adolescent brain, it almost becomes, it's this kind of problematic thing, and they can't do this yet. They don't understand that yet. And I think, we develop over a lifetime. All of us continue learning and developing all of the time. When you become an adult, when you live independently for the first time, if you have children, if you have grandchildren, if you move into a position of responsibility at work, we're all of us learning, developing all of the time. But somehow as adults, we don't consider that incomplete in the same way that we do with young people. So attention to strengths, I think, means paying attention to what people can do and not just what they can't do.
And then the other aspect of that was, I know you've got this very broad experience of looking at particularly other European countries' provision for adolescents, and you talked about there's a kind of intervention at a high level of problems, sort of a crisis. But then once we've intervened, we don't have the kind of level of support. I think that's what you're saying, that you might find in other countries, so that more of the therapeutic settings we don't seem to have to offer. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is about resourcing in the system. And I think that's partly, so if you think about the context of residential care as an example, residential care here is, it's very much seen as a last resort service. So if children are young people are being accommodated out of the home, it's very unlikely that residential provision would ever be made a first choice for someone. And I think that makes the work of residential care really challenging, because you have people coming into residential homes, I mean, one, often for very short periods. So and there was a pilot of using social pedagogic approaches in residential care a few years ago. And one of the challenges there was that there was never a kind of stable group in a lot of the homes, because you had some people moving in and out, some people who really needed more specialist therapeutic support than the home could provide, some people coming in as asylum seekers, so carrying the kind of trauma and the impact of the experiences that brought them to the UK, as well as then not necessarily having English language yet. And then you might have some people for whom this is their kind of longer term home, and trying to work as a group, trying to establish relationships around that, and to protect the relationships that you have in that context is going to be incredibly challenging for anybody. And I mean, my experience of doing research with residential care in other, particularly Northern European countries, is that it's not that you would choose residential care if you thought that family-based care would be an appropriate option, but you wouldn't see residential care as being an inappropriate option or a last resort option for a child. And that means, I think that, I mean, in Denmark, for example, there's a much greater variety of residential provision. So you would have local homes that allow local young people to continue to have their networks of friends, to keep going to the same schools. You might have more specialist provision where you have in homes, for example, family therapists coming in regularly to do work with the young person and the family towards return home. So it's about kind of resourcing that expertise and not recognizing trauma, recognizing the complex needs and complex relationships that bring people into the situation of needing that kind of care, and then thinking about what's the kind of appropriate expertise for addressing that. So involvement of psychotherapists or family therapists is, I think, much more routine. Certainly in the last cross-national study I did, it was very common for the young adults in Denmark and Norway to talk about psychotherapy as part of the kind of package of services that they would have, whereas it was really exceptional for the young adults in England that we spoke to have accessed that.
And do you think I mean, we have moved to a position now where taking a child into care, taking care proceedings is endlessly presented as the last resort. And then once they're in care, there's an assumption that that's it, that they're unlikely to return home. Do you think that actually is possibly an obstacle to working more effectively with young people, or not? Do you think that's appropriate?
I do. I think, when I was thinking about the questions ahead of time, one of the things that really struck me, and I did this review on permanence for the Care Inquiry a few years ago, and I don't think we think enough about what permanence really means or could mean for young people who come into the care system, or the youth justice system. Actually, young people who are removed from home through youth justice, because, and I guess there's kind of two things. One is about thinking beyond 18. Because, we know that people, even if they do stay in that care placement until they reach legal adulthood, they're very likely to end up going back and living with family. as young adults. But even if they don't, those relationships, those really important relationships with their families of origin continue to shape their lives. And that comes through really powerfully in the research that we've done. How many young adults are kind of coming out of care into caring responsibilities for other family members, and dealing with things like organising funerals and so on at very young ages, getting into debt in order to pay for funerals, for example. So I think it just, I guess really bluntly, I think it just doesn't work to think about permanence if you think about it stopping at adulthood. So whether or not somebody stays in the system through that period, whether or not you have some kind of short-term arrangements or shared care arrangements, flexibility around what placement looks like as a family support intervention. As the German legal framework talks about placement as help with upbringing, which is entirely consistent with the Children Act. That's we have that already in the legislation. But we should, I think we should always be thinking about what does then permanence look like for this individual young person? What does safe, meaningful relationships through childhood and beyond look like for this young person? And of course, you have to talk to the young person about what that looks like, because they will have a really clear sense of what that means. But I just think it's firefighting to think, oh, well, if we put them in this placement until they're 18, that somehow that addresses permanence needs. It just doesn't. So.
Thank you. And one final, coming back on what you were talking about, which you expressed some concern at the separation of youth justice and the family justice systems. And of course, they were separated in the 89 Act. Do you think actually that's possibly wasn't the right way to go?
I do. I think there's too much fragmentation in our system. So, between child and adult services, between social care, justice, health services. And I think that means that, our thinking gets governed by the service that we're working in rather than thinking about the young person holistically. And I think that then contributes to that that kind of stigmatizing and binarizing construction that, this is a young person who's a problem, who's engaged in crime. This is a young person who's vulnerable. This is a young person who stops being seen as a child because they're becoming a parent. So they go into a different system. This is a young person whose social care is not stable enough for them to get mental health support, even though they'll never get their placement stable until they've had some mental health support. So the more that we have systemic fragmentation, the more that's experienced, I think, by young people as their needs not being met and their lives not being understood in a holistic, person-centred way.
Thanks. Mike, is there anything you want to pick up on that area? Or...
there's too many. I think there's been a load of phenomenal key points that have been made here. So I think to pick one out of the many would just be, I think there's a lot of great points that have been made, especially the key thing about places like social services, the youth offending services and health services having that separation. I think that does cause more of a distance between communities and the services they receive in, because it means you're going to one for one thing, going to another, and there's a miscommunication between these services as well. So I think that's awesome. Yeah.
Thank you. But it also, I don't know if you would agree that it means that you as the you as the young person are the one that's kind of having to hold it all together, because you're the only one that's crossing all the spaces. And when we talk about giving too much responsibility to young people, that seems to me really like kind of ironic that, you know, they're the one that ends up doing all of that kind of holding together.
Yeah, very good point. Moving on now, we've got the next question is, you know, what's good about the current system? So, you know, we've specified in the question 3 things that you'd keep, but it could be more, it could be less. But what do you think we need to hold on to and not kind of get rid of tomorrow?
I mean, I think, I don't know if I have 3, but I think that I'll start with, I think the Children Act, despite the point about separation, I think the Children Act is a really good underpinning piece of legislation. And that principle of permanence across different services, starting from family support, that emphasis in the Act on family support and partnership with families, I think all of that is so important. I would like to see that being strengthened and how that's enacted rather than being kind of replaced. I guess the question is how that's implemented and how that's supported. And I suppose the other thing, this might be a slightly controversial one, but tell me what you think, is that the idea of corporate parenthood gets a lot of criticism as being this kind of meaningless thing. But I do think that if you do such a drastic thing as to intervene into the upbringing of a child through the family justice system, then I think there is a kind of moral obligation that goes with that to say, yes, and I will take on sharing that responsibility as corporate parent. I have that ethical duty for the upbringing of this child. But then I think the question is, how do you make that meaningful? And I guess one of the things I would say is that corporate parenthood should be a lifetime responsibility. And I mean like corporate grandparenthood or great grandparenthood when you get to that point as well. But that's, you know, I think I would really like to see that as a challenge. How do you make corporate parenthood something that's not just something that academics like me quote sarcastically when they're criticizing it? And how do you make it into something that's really more like, you know, what parenting is designed to do? And if you're saying, you know, if you're taking from the Children Act the idea that this is the state sharing responsibility, then you can almost think of that, I guess, in a way of like a kind of idea of shared custody after separation or divorce. What are the bits you're going to do? What are the bits we're going to do? How are we going to use the resources of the state to strengthen this family, to enable that permanence for that young person, so that the corporate parent becomes part of that safe, secure, stable family through childhood and beyond. So I think that's worth keeping, but, you know, there's work to be done.
Yes, so that's interesting because it's kind of how you do that, isn't it? Yeah. And it's thinking about how you develop a process around that's real. Have you seen that in action anywhere that you would point to as that's an example of how it could be done?
Yes.
Oh, go on.
I'm not gonna name the authority, but I was the chair of a children's council, and we actually had a lot of engagement with the directors of this local authority, and they were considered corporate parents. And there was there's a corporate parent in Hamburg, there's loads of stuff around corporate parenting and what it is to be a corporate parent. And I think there's a big thing of a lot of people don't acknowledge they are corporate parents. And I think if they was to enter a certain position or role with that understanding of they are a corporate parent and they do have these obligations for life, I think it will create a massive barrier. But again, having the young people working with corporate parents, making young people aware of what a corporate parent is and making professionals aware of what it means to be a corporate parent from corporate parents as well, that's a very key thing, because then you can actually understand, what do you mean by corporate parent?
Yeah.
And what do I understand as corporate parent? So I think having that connection of young people and corporate parents meeting, then yeah.
Yeah. I think that I think that's so spot on. I think it it just makes me think, listening to you, that you almost need to have like parenting classes, like we have kind of parent training for new parents, of kind of go and you learn how to do whatever. People go to classes when they're pregnant to find out how to do the basics of looking after a baby. If people are stepping into a role that carries that responsibility of corporate parenting, then let's think about what that means to be a corporate parent. Let's have some parenting classes on that. I mean, I guess one of the things that I would add to that, and I feel that, the last two studies I've done, we've done interviews with young adults, kind of 18 to 32-year-olds who were in care in childhood. And one of the things that has, I think, more than anything struck home to me is that it's, a third of, I think it's 34% in the UK of 18 to 32-year-olds live in their parental home. And yet we expect care experienced people to move into independence, from an age when, really the vast majority of 18-year-olds are still at home, or, if they do move out, they move out for a term to study and then come back again. And we know from research, kind of more broadly with young people, that increasingly young people, because of the employment situation for young adults in this country, because of the cost of higher education, the cost of training and so on, the cost of rents, affordable housing, bills, all of that, young adults rely more and more on family for support. And we did one of the papers we wrote from our cross-national study was about, this is kind of answering your question, Mary, in a long way round, was about looking at kind of transitions in early adulthood that were nothing to do with having been in care. So that might be things like, and one of the examples was a young woman who'd not long moved in with her boyfriend and she found out he was cheating on her. Another example would be somebody starting a course at university, realizing it wasn't the right course for them. Another example was somebody getting their mobile phone nicked, and the people that stole it ran up a massive bill, which they, without them realizing. So they're all the kind of things that are really not that unusual in early adulthood. But they're the sorts of experiences that, for somebody who can't take for granted those family resources, we talked in the paper about the idea of scaffolding. So it's kind of the support that allows you to be independent. It's not about being dependent. It's about being supported through early adulthood and all of the things that we all have to deal with in early adulthood to varying degrees. And if you don't have that support, then those kinds of experiences can be really destabilizing, can cause things to spiral, can cause you to have to rely on people that are not safe for you to have to rely on. But with support, they can be really easy to navigate, really easy to kind of get through. Okay, that university course wasn't right for you. Well, that doesn't mean you're not able to go to university. That just might mean you need a bit of time out to think about what you really want to study. Maybe you want to study, they're the kind of things that, if you're thinking about the kind of notions of what good parenting would look like, and ideally, it would be about people that are there to pick up the pieces. So the example of the person who found out that her boyfriend was cheating, she was in a special guardianship placement, and her family swooped in, cleared her and all her stuff out of the flat in a day, left the boyfriend to deal with the tenancy agreement and all of that. So I think in the end, his mum had to pick up the pieces. And she talked about just having been rescued by that. But so my question would be that, so for somebody who's not in a special guardianship placement and something like that happens, I mean, many of us have been cheated on and had difficult breakups in our lives. Who swoops in to rescue you? Who's the person that you can pick up the phone and say, this has happened. Oh, someone nicked my phone and they've run up 500 quid of debt. What do I do? So, we talk a lot about outcomes for young people from care. And I don't think we pay enough attention to just those kind of ordinary challenges of everyday life. But when you're dealing with those ordinary challenges, they're incredibly important and can be incredibly difficult. So I would really like to see corporate parenthood that provides that kind of parenting through people's 20s, through their 30s, when you're suddenly dealing with having to buy school uniform for 2 kids at once and you're short of money, who do you go to then? That's the corporate grandparenthood bit. I think it needs to be a lifelong responsibility.
That's really helpful. And that leads us nicely actually into the third question, which Mike is going to ask you.
Yes. I also want to put a little twist onto this question. So one thing that has come up a lot in your answers has been cost, funding, underfunding, austerity. So I'm going to phrase this question in a certain way. I'm going to paint a picture and I want you to tell me what you see. So it's 2020. The earth is roughly in £250 billion worth of debt.
Mm-hmm.
What is your vision for the future?
That's a really good question. So I think that questions about debt and how we manage debt and what we choose to spend money on are, they have to be political questions. It's about how you choose to prioritize. And I think, government debt isn't the same as household debt. It's not like there's kind of, the government gets paid a certain amount every month, and if they've spent it, they've spent it. Governments make political choices about how to prioritize their spending. And, I guess I would go back to what I was saying before, that if you're talking about family justice or youth justice, and you're talking about stepping into family lives when they're at breaking point, then, we know that the care system can already be hugely costly. We know that, there's some residential places, for example, that cost £10,000 a week. So I suppose one thing I would say is that if we invest more in supporting families, and supporting families in relation to poverty, as well as in relation to parenting needs, if we invest in youth services, if we invest in things that give people ideas of, opportunities in their lives, things that they can do, so that you don't feel like you have to rely on, doing a little job for a gang, so that you don't have to ask your parent, who you know is struggling, for money so that you can get the trainers that you really want or something. If we can invest in supporting families, if we can invest in supporting young people in ways that, because I think, young people carry that, especially when we're talking about teenage years, young people really carry that that pressure of family poverty, of trying to help out, of feeling responsible, but also that pressure of feeling like there's no way out of that. And that's, that maybe makes people more vulnerable to then kind of pressures from outside, from peers, from local gangs and so on. So I think investing at that level potentially saves money down the line, because you're not making it so likely that those young people in those families will get to breaking point. And equally, I think then, because there will always be people for whom care is necessary, is the right decision, is in their best interests. But then I think if people are at that point, then I do think we have a responsibility as a society to say, okay, well, if the state is intervening into your upbringing, then we carry on with that. So on one level, I don't care if this might sound very naive, but I don't care if we're, as a planet, £50 billion in debt, or 500 trillion pounds in debt. I think we have a kind of ethical and moral responsibility as a society to support the upbringing of children and young people, because children and young people bear the brunt of what happens in society, and they're often made to feel responsible for things like we see with all the COVID stuff going on just now. And young people get blamed for being spreaders at the same time as they're in this horrendous situation of being locked down and cooped up and criminalised if they try and go out and meet their friends. So I think we have an ethical duty to make this a priority, and a priority over other things, maybe like building roads or something. I don't know, but I'm not enough of a politician to answer that question. But I think that's where the priority should be from my point of view. Does that answer your question?
As a human being, perfectly, I think that answers it. As a human being, definitely. Like you said, you couldn't answer it as a politician, because obviously we know how politicians work. Yeah. But yeah, no, I definitely love the perception. I love the angle. I be more resourceful with what we have, instead of trying to create something out of nothing, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. That it's, this has to be the priority. If I was the Children's Commissioner, I would be pushing for kind of children and young people's needs to be the starting point of every policy decision, whether that is roads or schools or youth justice or family justice. What is this going to mean? Because it's, young people are the ones that are going to be around dealing with it, not the 80-year-olds who are sitting there kind of, tweeting or whatever.
You talked a bit about working in the silo working of mental health or youth justice or whatever across those. There's always been a lot of talk about trying to work in a more holistic way, working better together. Do you think have you seen ways in which you can see that being unlocked? So because that would save money if people were sort of better organised about that.
I think, it is always challenging, but I think and this is true in work that I've done in other European countries as well as here, I do think that integrated working makes a difference. I think when you have integrated, co-located teams, I think one of the things you really need, I'm not just going to say money again, but you need that top down, this is how it's going to happen. So you can't just rely on those people being good-willed, good-natured, working together. You need to have the structures and systems for doing that. And I think that does make a difference. I think it really makes a difference. This is going to make me sound really old now, but the old idea of the lead professional, that you have one person that is, when I was talking about the child holding the responsibility for the joining up, to have somebody alongside them who holds that responsibility. I've done projects in the past where I did a project a few years ago looking at a model called family intervention projects, which was particularly kind of intensive interventions for families that were judged to be at risk, troubling to society. And I remember one of the families we interviewed where, there were two parents, both of them had physical and mental health problems, several children who had special educational needs, issues going on with school. Some of the children had physical health problems, CAMHS referrals as well. And there was something like 23 different professional agencies involved with that family. And, I'm someone as a working parent who, has sent my children to school with like deeply dirty PE kit because I haven't managed to sort out washing it, or forgetting crucial things that I'm supposed to have done for them, forgetting my own dentist appointments on top of everything else I'm juggling. And I remember sitting there just being kind of in awe of how would you possibly keep on top of 23 different professional agencies being involved in your family. And the family intervention project worker held all that together and helped them to get it organised and manageable, and advocated for them with the different agencies and so on, and turned it from something with the family, turned it from something totally overwhelming to something that was then kind of doable. So I do, I think it's been tried before, and it's always going to be difficult, and there will always be some professionals that are resistant to it. But I think it just has to be a way of working, and it has to be, it has to be kind of routinized. I guess that's one of the challenges, that when we've had when we've had attempts at this in the past, they've often been like pilot projects and initiatives, and let's do a trial of this or let's do a trial of that. And I think to some extent these are just principles. The young person shouldn't be the one that holds the responsibility for joining the dots. Somebody else has to be doing that. There have to be structures in place that ensure that happens.
Thank you. It's really helpful. Mike, have you got anything else you want to ask? Or indeed, we're coming to the end now, Janet. You'll be relieved to hear you can...
I could talk all day, Mary.
Good. I know. Well, it's great to hear you. Mike, have you got anything? Or Seth or Bev?
No, I think she knows exactly how young people feel. Yeah, I think you'd be a great children's commissioner, even though I don't know what their role does exactly yet. But I think if it's got anything to do with promoting young people's rights, entitlements and well-being, yeah, all for it. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
That's what they're supposed to do. You have to watch the new one and see if she does. Thank you. That's like the biggest
high praise, Janet. Yes,
I know. I'm quite.
I'll be honest. I gave you a few rounds of applause while I was muted.
Oh, you're gonna set me off. Thank you, Mike.
I just want to pick up on a point that you just made 10 minutes ago that was really a beautiful moment for me. And you said if the state intervenes, then the state needs to carry on caring. Now, I wondered if you could maybe just develop that a bit further and even maybe suggest how it might carry on.
Happily. So I think if we think about the idea of corporate parenthood as being a lifetime responsibility, then I guess it's thinking about, different aspects of that as someone goes through adulthood. So one of the really kind of practical things would be about ensuring adequate financial support to young people or young adults beyond leaving care ages. And I think, there's that phrase like the bank of mum and dad. So which is like where you go in an emergency, isn't it? Ideally, if your mum and dad are rich enough to be able to provide that. So perhaps as corporate parent, you should be the bank of mum and dad for young adults. And that, that for me goes back to that framing of young people as being problematic in some way. Why would we not do that? Do we think that people would exploit it, that they would misuse it? Are we that kind of parent that doesn't trust our children as a corporate parent? Or are we the kind of parent that wants them to be safe and secure, that wants the best for them? And I think if I think about some of the people that we've interviewed and the things that they struggle with, they're such ordinary things, like paying for driving lessons, like people moving out of, shared living accommodation, whether that's through childhood or whether that's people finishing university and then moving into their first flat and suddenly dealing with bills for a flat on your own on top of having to decorate, perhaps. That's something that we saw pushing people into debt, just that kind of having a whole set of bills for a whole flat. It's much more expensive than if you're sharing bills that are split 5 ways. So I think that kind of ongoing financial support, I would say, is one really concrete part of it. But I think there should also be then kind of ongoing access to other kinds of support as needed. So, we've talked a bit about mental health support. I think one of the other things that we see in our research, and I don't think we're alone in this, is that, mental health support has to come at the right time for someone. It has to come when they're ready to deal with whatever they're carrying. So why would you not, if somebody's 28 or 35, say they're having their own children and then that suddenly brings stuff up, say their own children are turning the same age they were when they were removed into care, and that's the moment that it brings stuff up, why would you not say, in the way that you might say, to a parent or a grandparent, I'm finding things tough right now, why would you not be able to pick up and follow that? And I think that will only work if you've got enough of an ongoing relationship, if you've got a sense of that continuity, that this is and of course the staffing will change, but why not? This is a collective group of people that I know have my back, that I'm part of that family, that I can draw on. So I think, there's a quote that I think I used in the Care Inquiry that I really like, which is about talking about parenthood and talking about potentially limitless enormity of being a parent. And that's what it means to be a parent. You're whatever you need to be for that. That's what it's supposed to be about. So why not be that radical? Why not think in those terms, or start small with like paying for driving lessons, having accessible loans that you can just call up and ask for help when you need it. And then think beyond that into, I really like Mike's idea of then teaching people what what would it look like to be a good corporate parent? But not stopping that. And I think particularly, and I will make this my last point on this, particularly thinking about care experienced people becoming parents, because that's a really difficult moment. And it's a moment when normally becoming a parent, you rely on family support through that transition. So, care experienced people often experience a lot of judgment about becoming a parent, especially if they're young, but they don't necessarily experience a lot of support with that. And I think that idea of corporate grandparenthood is a really important one.
Thank you. That's brilliant.
I just want to thank you, because even though I don't know you, I really do feel like you have young people in your heart. And I'm not just saying that, because literally you've said some things in this interview that has resonated with my personal circumstances as me being a consequence of my circumstances as a care leaver. And literally you've quoted things that I have said to Seth on a personal level this week, which means you definitely are on the right path, and whatever that path is, just keep going. Yeah.
Can I just say thank you so much? That means more to me than anything. It really, really, really does.